Welcome to those joining us. We are letting everyone filter in. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, everyone. Okay, we have a lot of attendees tonight, so I'm just going to let everyone filter through and then we will start the event properly. As everyone filters in, this might be a good opportunity before I introduce Daisy and her work for me to just introduce the York Centre for Writing Poetry series if you don't already know it. So my name is Dr Rebecca Tamás and I co-convene the York Centre for Writing Poetry series with my colleague Caleb Places. And the poetry series covers contemporary poets who we're very lucky to bring to York St John to share their work and ideas. And it focuses on writers who are from, one or more of a kind of queer, working class or BAME background. We're really trying to challenge the idea that poetry is an elitist, stale, pale and male preserve. Not that it hasn't been, but that's something that we're all kind of hoping as a community to change, and showing how dynamic and exciting contemporary poetry in the UK is at the moment, which I know is something Caleb and I both believe to be very true, and that there is so much fantastic work out there for people to access and engage with. So that's what the Centre for Writing Poetry series is all about. We've had previous readers like Varney Capildeo, Will Harris and Amy Blakemore. And if you haven't been to an event with us before, welcome. We're so glad to have you, and we hope that you'll continue to engage with our events in the future as well. And we're really hoping that even if and when we return to live events, that we'll be able to record those events and kind of continue to share them. Okay. So hello to everyone who's just joined us. I'm just doing a drawn out introduction as everyone filters in. Something I wanted to say is we have live transcript turned on. If it would be helpful to you to see the live transcript, then please click on live transcript and choose show so that you can see the transcript. You also have the option to click view full transcript. That will create a pop-out box where you can see everything separated by who is talking. So that's just a kind of accessibility option. If you do wish to engage with that, then you can. Okay. So I'm pretty sure that most people are now here. And that being the case, I will begin. So if you weren't here for the beginning of my preamble ramble, my name is Rebecca Tamás and I co-convene the York Centre for Writing Poetry series with my colleague Caleb Places. We are really honoured and excited to have Daisy Lafarge with us here today. To give you a very brief introduction to some of Daisy's life and works, Daisy Lafarge was born in Hastings and studied at the University of Edinburgh. Her poetry collection Life Without Air, which was published by Granta books in 2020, was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her visual work has been exhibited in galleries such as Tate St Ives and Talbot Rice Gallery. Paul, the winner of the Betty Trask Award, is her debut novel. So Daisy, thank you very much indeed for being here. Before we start, I just wanted to let everyone know how the evening is going to run. So Daisy is going to be sharing some prose and some poetry with us first in a reading. Then I'm going to be asking a few questions. And then it will be the chance of the audience. However, you can write your questions in the Q&A box, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your Zoom screen throughout the event. So if there's something Daisy says or something that you notice in a poem that you want to kind of ask about or reflect on, you don't have to wait until the end. Please just pop it in the Q&A box. And then when it comes to the final section, I'm going to go into that and I will ask Daisy as many questions as we possibly have time for. So as I say, you don't need to wait. Please put your Q&A questions in the box. Okay, I think that is all that anyone needs to know. The only final thing to say is that tonight's event is being recorded. So if you wish for your question to be anonymous, that is an option that you can choose in the Q&A box, and then I won't read your name or pick you out. Okay, Daisy, thank you so much for being here. When you're ready, it'd be fantastic if you could share your reading.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, and to the poetry series for having me. thanks everyone for coming, especially as we can now all actually go outside, so thank you for being inside this evening. I wanted to start by reading something new, but I have been experiencing something that I think is quite common in that I haven't been able to write any poems during the pandemic at all. So what I'm going to start by reading is a part of an essay that was recently published in the Garden collection. And that is taken from a longer essay that I published as a risograph print last year. And the essay is loosely about, I was really lucky to start renting somewhere with a garden for the first time just before the first lockdown last year, and I got very obsessed with a particular, well, it's considered a weed that grows in the garden, and that's called green alkanet. Fourth tongue. The fourth tongue is a rhythm, a reciprocity. Still raining, and the last patch of green alkanet wilting beneath the eucalyptus, aphid heavy. Before the rain started, and before the aphids had tipped over whatever equilibrium existed between them and the alkanet, I had unexpectedly interrupted a family gathering. It was late April. I picked a blue flower head and placed it on a glass slide. Through the microscope, I found myself eye to eye with an enormous mother aphid, her body fattened. I remember reading that black ants farm aphids and milk them like cows, and the colour of pale celadon. She was motionless, poised near the centre of the flower that crystallised an intense copper sulphate blue around her. Everything was still until I noticed another aphid, a fifth of her size, clambering up towards her. This aphid, who I presumed was her young, seemed to embody the neotenous features of cartoonish cuteness. Huge, wide-set eyes and spindly, curious antennae that probed about endearingly as it approached her. As I watched them, words like tender drifted across my mind, refusing to dissipate. I was bringing other words too, like mother, family, gathering, child. I knew this had more to do with me than the aphids, and that in another mood I might have brought words like prey, victim, attacker, cruelty. I knew that words in general weren't advisable, but I had never known how to stop. I wondered if the way I should be looking, with scientific impartiality, was any less partial or rife with projection. Regardless of the scene's true essence, I soon felt like an invasive species myself and put everyone, flowerhead, aphid, and aphid, back outside. Later, I read that 6 varieties of aphid have been recorded on green alkanet in the UK, and one of them is particular to the borage family of plants. From the grainy footage I had taken of the mother aphid, this one seemed to best resemble those currently overrunning my plants. When I searched for aphid and alkanet symbiosis, what turned up instead was the aphid symbiosis with a bacterium that lives in its hindgut. This bacterium, I read, has lived in a symbiotic relationship with aphids for 160 to 280 million years. Prior to this, it is believed that its ancestors lived freely in the environment, similar to E. coli, with which it shares 1/7 of its genome. In the intervening hundreds of millions of years, aphids and this bacterium have become mutually dependent. The bacteria provide aphids with essential amino acids missing from their diet of plant sap, while the aphid's hindgut provides the bacteria with a warm, stable environment, outside of which they can no longer survive. As a result of this long-standing relationship, the bacterium has lost a large swathe of its genes, leaving it with one of the smallest but also most stable genomes of any living organism. I look back at the plants and wonder if their relationship with the aphids is heading in a similar direction. How long does it take for two species to be so symbiotically enmeshed that one of them begins shedding genetic material like old skin? I find myself worrying on behalf of the organism with a shrinking genome about misplaced trust in this dynamic. What if the host you believe will support you indefinitely begins to behave otherwise, by which point you have already jettisoned the adaptive faculties that would enable you to live without it? In another paper, I read that scientists believe this particular mutualism between aphids and bacteria may aid in greater understanding of symbiogenesis. Symbiogenesis, popularized by Lynn Margulis, posits evolution as a frenzy of illicit mergers. Billions of years ago, free living cells were engulfed by other cells and began to act like their organs, a series of integrations which led to the development of multicellular life. If the traditional model of evolution is a tree, symbiogenesis reveals the thick meshwork abstracting its shape, where roots rise up and latch onto branches, and flowers grow along dark mycelial paths, blooming underground. With symbiogenesis in mind, I wonder whether this bacterium has become, or is on its way to becoming, one of the aphid's organs. And if our own lives result from this history of multi-species mergers, whose genetic residue we carry in our bodies, then the concept of distinct and separate species is troubled. We are all already interwoven, twined in various stages of becoming each other's organs. The unsuitability of the tree model is perhaps also the failing of taxonomy, the notion that one branch will grow obediently from another. But the branches are untamable and wayward, swapping names and genetic material while the botanists' backs are turned. And now I'll read from Life Without Air, which is actually, I think, the first time I've done this year. There were a lot of readings before Christmas because it came out in November, so here we are. Falsification air. What can I pass on, you ask, about methods of detecting the air? It has become so habitual, I am not sure where to begin. Each morning I walk into the world looking for signs. Early, before light is normalized by the shadow of buildings and the gentle fraying of traffic. It seems the signs are most attracted to states of dereliction. To receive them, it helps to be empty, but imbued with residual function like a disused water tower or any number of withering technologies. Lie back. Let the world grow over you like weeds. Consider the sheets of air gridlocked in double glazing. Now are you beginning to understand? There's a very sensitive dog that lives next door, so you might hear him barking. He has to wear a bib that says space needed when he goes outside, which I can really relate to. Aggregate air. What immunity for buildings against their uprooting? City skins grown thick with corporate heraldry, scabbing the air tight to wound. On every corner, a tree articulates its script, whole flyovers cracked with growing pains. For a short while, we considered talking cures, a vernacular for pipelines, circuitry, the fetid grids and systems. We soiled our mouths to mimic the good fettle of root and seed, waited quietly for the rains. Asbestos air. Lichen and moss grooming your body, it is a relief to watch things grow without difficulty. Wifedom as triage of pleats and timeliness. She's down on the floor by way of a pretty phrase. It is not the day to think of how buildings get built. She can no longer be considered detached as a gable end. Like a shared roof, she has implications and is implicated. Fossil dinner. Enter my husband, most lauded cartographer of our day, who truly loves nothing more than hosting his colleagues for dinner, where they can relax and talk department and eat the flesh of animals, or perhaps loves nothing more than the exhibition of our tablecloth, which I spend my time mending and amending, a thick map of his design woven with silk and sandaline, landforms of mi-fleur stuccoed green and gold, sea forms pricked with taffeta asters, the borders drawn blackly in thread. My role at the dinners is to mind the cloth and not to speak, to be present, so to speak. This evening, all is de rigueur. There is food on the landmasses and wine on the estuaries. My husband and his colleagues talk of sprezzatura and deep time, of a man called Marianus. As usual, Eric the paleontologist takes advantage of the table's subterranea and puts his hand on my knee, talking loudly of his proclivity for layers, while I sit still as a fossil, i.e. vibrating furiously. Furstengot the theologian is more composed. He holds forth about ecclesia and the hot bun of Christ. Tonight there's a papery crust around his mouth like yeast. My husband contends. He passes his hand over a nearby tundra and asks, is creation not a vesture? Does the world not accentuate God the way a dress hints at a woman's divine curvature? The moment is punctured by the arrival of the langoustine. I raise my eyes from the tablecloth and drop my mouth. The poor dish looks just like me. I become aware of breathing heavily. My breath comes out in clouds over the territory and each one leaves a contrail, stinking softly of feathers. The clouds segue on the far side of the table and begin to rain formic acid over the crudités. No one speaks as an atmosphere pulls itself together. My husband, the cartographer, becomes annoyed. He is disinclined to weather. The excess moisture begins to crease the cloth, and his attempts to smooth it down simply make the folds migrate and reassemble elsewhere. I gulp down the clouds and try to smile in a way that conveys, don't worry, darling, it's simply the appearance and reappearance of form. His left hand turns white from its grip on the fish knife. At a loss, I open my mouth and point at it, meaning the natural world is in here. But it's too late. Eric comes for my left arm and Furstengot for my right. They push my head down and my husband, the cartographer, lifts the tablecloth up over me, forcing me under on all fours as the dishes and aperitifs clatter away from my terrible orogeny. Soon my eyes adjust to the underseas and counter-earths and the reverse stitching of territories. From somewhere above comes the muffled voice of my husband, apologizing. You see, she is vulnerable and subject to historical flux. Eric replies that the discourse is the backdrop. Furstengot says, the meaning won't stand for itself. Parasite climax. The clouds are polyamorous, wanting one and both, and earworm's autoeroticism rubs a brain against itself. A woman self-seeds her elements through the city, wondering if the species that didn't emerge live on as contrails of alignment, currents of the possible and possible not, gutless borers of the world dig on. This is the untitled coda from the end of the book, which is taken from the scientist Louis Pasteur's lab notes for an experiment. In our memoir on spontaneous generation, everything combined to prevent the interference of air. On March 23rd, we filled the shape represented, a most simple method of observing the deadly effect of air. To assure ourselves we filled 2 tubes, we cited a mineral medium. On April 9th, we composed a liquid. This liquid had previously been left to herself. This liquid, the author says, had a feeble reaction. For the first few days, she remained perfectly clear, then began to grow turbid. On that same day, we first observed a deposit between the mercury and the sides of the tube. Kept at summer heat, she speedily swarmed with organisms. By evening, a tolerable activity had begun to manifest. On the 5th day, a few bubbles betokened. On May 13th, we refrained from impregnating. We examined a drop. She was less vigorous without having actually ceased. Under observation, she seemed to languish. She showed every sign of intense unease and asphyxia, although mobile at the articulations. After having lived without air, we concluded that she could not be suddenly exposed. We were forced to regard her as a distinct species and have employed the vaguest nomenclature, leaving her absolutely intact. She possesses unusual powers of resistance. She may be brought to a state of dry dust and be wafted about by winds. Thank you.
Hi Daisy, thank you so much for sharing that work. Yeah, it was amazing. I feel like my brain is sort of kind of processing all the different kind of elements that were taking place there. And I'm really glad that you started us off with that essay. It was fantastic to hear you read it live. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to kind of follow that fantastic reading up by asking some questions. But as I said before, for those of you in the audience, please, place questions in the Q&A as we kind of go on. And hopefully there'll be enough time to cover a bunch. I mean, I definitely have more questions than I can actually ask. So I think I'll kind of circle through a few different topics. I'm obviously such a fan of this book, and that's mainly what I'm going to be focusing on, is Daisy's most recent poetry collection, Life Without Air. But before I get into some of the kind of nitty gritty, I just sort of wanted to ask you a kind of question of process, because, reading this text, it's so multi-layered and kind of intellectually sophisticated. There are so many different moving parts all working together. So I was really curious just to get, quite a simple sense from you of how the book came together, what the writing process was like. I kind of realised when I was thinking about this, I didn't have a picture. Is this a book that was kind of built from extensive research? Was it a long writing process, a short one? It would just be fascinating to kind of, just hear your thoughts on that journey, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it wasn't a book that was written as like one clear concept. It kind of brings together, I think the earliest poem in here is maybe, at least at the time of publication, it was 5 years old. And so there was a part or an element to putting it together where, you know, I kind of sent everything I had to my editor and said, you know, I think this is good, I think this is rubbish. And it was a kind of, yeah, like a process over, I suppose, about a year in discussion, kind of bringing certain things together. And then I suppose the themes came together quite naturally. I didn't set out to write a book about air. I kind of feel more like maybe it had already found me, because I'd written a pamphlet that was published in 2017 called Understudies for Air. And I think that was 23 poems, and maybe 11 of those are in this collection. And then I was reading about Louis Pasteur and his amazing phrase, life without air, separately. And then it kind of like that pulled the concept for this book together. And then once the rough concept was there, I found I was able to write some of the newer poems that are in the collection that kind of hopefully pull it together a bit. Yeah, so.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, yeah, some of the kind of things that you've touched on will kind of recur in my other questions, but yeah, it's I like the idea of the kind of the concept finding you in some ways and kind of leading you through that process. Something else that I'm obviously very sort of interested in regard to this book is the way in which this is not solely, but, you know, very importantly, an environmental text. And I'm interested in the way that the book kind of manages to express complicated environmental experience. So it's very much not a black and white kind of nature versus the human response at all. If anything, it seems like a book of kind of profound human, non-human interrelation, at the same time that it never sort of posits any kind of comfy or holistic union, which is what I find most interesting. And I'm thinking of one of my favourite poems from the collection, which is called Dredging the Bautu Lake. I'm saying that right. And there are some lines in that, for those who haven't read it. Lest we forget, the screen of your phone turned green from the night you cried into its face, as though the very pixels could impute a body's affects. Traipse from sidewalk to goddess, and which are the hands of the woman who built it, the ghost-handed mother who says there and there. And I'm fascinated by that section because this sense of what we consider most intimate and personal, like our phones full of private messages, are kind of embedded in these damaging systems of capital that exploit human beings and natural resources. So my question is, what did you want to draw out about the environmental systems which underlie our everyday experiences?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think it would be trying to cultivate a view of ecology, as you said. I mean, you know, there is a holism to it, a kind of sense of, you know, everything is connected, but that doesn't mean all of the connections are necessarily easy, and there are quite a lot of contradictions, like in that poem that you speak about. It also touches on the fact that, you know, this kind of toxic polluted lake is made by, it's kind of the byproduct of us producing green technology as well. So it's this kind of like a kind of inherent contradiction. And I suppose with like, I think there can be a use for the kind of non-human human divide, but I'm also really resistant to it as like any kind of clear boundary. I think I'm much more interested in thinking about like where that line is completely blurred or almost doesn't exist, in the sense that, you know, we're made up of like loads of stuff that isn't human, both in terms of like a kind of evolutionary past where, like, you know, some bacteria that used to like live in the environment is now the thing in ourselves that enables us to breathe. But also, I suppose, in like a kind of more current, contemporary, like tricky ecological sense, and like, you know, like being filled with microplastics, as we all are, and like things that we breathe in. And so I feel like that, there were these two kinds of like material realities going on now. Does that answer the question?
It really does, yeah, thank you so much. And actually that leads pretty perfectly into my next question, which is that was really struck by the way in which the book manages to kind of use or talk about non-human beings and realities, and it uses them to explore human emotions and affects, but it also manages to use, which I think is the kind of rarer part, human emotions and experiences to understand non-human realities. There's no kind of simplified anthropocentrism. So I'm thinking, for example, of the poem Ghosted, the quote, my love is too full of good bacteria, and that whole poem, for anyone that has the book. We learn something in the poem about bacteria and lions, but the relationship also seems metaphorically symbiotic rather than parasitic. We also learn something about the speaker. It's that interrelation again, I guess, that we've talked about. And I was just wondering if you could talk about using the human to think the non-human in the book, and also vice versa in your poetry.
Yeah, of course. I guess I'm just kind of interested at that point where you can't quite tell if something is metaphorical or literal, and the cases where those two states kind of pass into each other. So sometimes I feel like using almost different kind of frames or terminology from kind of importing them from other contexts, it kind of estranges the familiar, and that estrangement, for me anyway, it allows me to look at something in a way that I personally find more kind of constructive or interesting while I'm writing. But it's also not, I wouldn't say it's like a fully conscious process on my part. I don't think like, right, this time I'm going to use, the language of like heart surgery or something. It's more like, when you're just interested in reading about something and certain words or ways of speaking sort of get lodged in your mind, and then you'll be thinking about something completely different, and they make this strange kind of symbiosis with each other. And yeah, I suppose in the example that you gave about Ghosted, yeah, I mean, I think part of that was that one thing I found maybe interesting in relation to that is this idea that a lot of ecological states aren't fixed. So for example, like some like bacteria that we classify as parasitic, they're not like inherently parasitic. They behave the same way as like good bacteria, but they've just been exposed to different things in their environment that make them act in a certain way. And so sometimes I think like analogies like that can be imported onto kind of relationships between people, almost to like de-essentialize certain ways of talking about things. I feel like that was a really convoluted way of saying something. But also I think it's, I think sometimes I'm playing with like different etymologies, because a lot of people have picked up on when they're speaking about the way I've used language in this book, they say I'm kind of importing like ecological metaphors into like intimate or romantic ones. But there are some instances like the word like parasite was originally a word from used to describe social relations. Like it was like to parasitize was to like eat at someone's table, and then it became incorporated into ecology and it became an ecological term, and then it kind of I don't know, it kind of developed this strange trajectory where we feel like it came from biology. So yeah, I just find things like that really fascinating.
That is really fascinating. I did not know that. But yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you, Daisy. I mean, my final sort of question on these sort of themes is, inevitably when we have conversations about any writing in whatever genre that's environmentally inflected rather, we're obviously also kind of inevitably talking about work that is shaped by environmental and climate collapse, and the relationship also between that work and action. And I'm not going to kind of ask any really simplified question about like how poetry can save the world, because I think that's in some ways quite an unhelpful question, but I'm really curious to find out what role you think poetry has in thinking our contemporary environmental moment. Do you think that there's something specific to poetry that it can do particularly well that maybe other forms of art can't?
Yeah, it's tricky because sometimes, I mean, I don't really like to draw like too clear like dividing lines between genre and form, but I would say that maybe something that's like particular to poetry, even though it can occur in other genres, is a kind of commitment to making strange language as its material. And obviously language is the way that we understand the world and also understand or fail to understand climate catastrophe. And so I think that, you know, I think there might be something in the process of poetry that can kind of, you know, kind of break things apart. It can take meanings apart. It can take like contexts, various things apart, sorry. Yeah, I don't know, this is something I puzzle over a lot. And yeah, I'm probably gonna think of what I mean in about an hour's time.
You can let me know, no one else will find out, but you know. But no, I think that's really interesting, but I also thought it was really interesting what you were saying about not necessarily wanting to demarcate too strictly about different genres. And almost the tension between trying to recognize what a certain form can do, but also not trying to kind of like reify it or formalize it is interesting as well. You know, Daisy has a novel that I mentioned called Fall coming out, which isn't out yet, but it will be very interesting for all of you to kind of read that in light of what you're saying about the different types of language and the different kind of sort of social and political and environmental thinking they make possible. Yeah, I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't. I'll move on to my next question, which is about a kind of another sort of central tenet of my experience anyway of reading the book, which is sort of toxic misogyny, female experience, and the expression of female identified voices. And that obviously comes to the fore in poems like A Question for Zeno or Fossil Dinner, which you read from. And I just wanted to ask, you know, if you could put into words, what was it? And I suppose, of course, there are so many different elements of misogyny that one can address, but one particular element that you look at in this book is the way in which women's voices are taken away. And obviously that's particularly notable in the poem that you read. And I would just be curious whether you felt that there was any link between environmental toxicity, which we've already touched on, and that kind of patriarchy. And if not, just be interested to hear you kind of talk about that representation of women's voices.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do, not in any kind of like essential sense, you know, in the way that I think like women are closer to nature or anything like that. It's more like this sense that women and other marginalized groups have been subject to the same kind of oppression and destruction and censorship as the environment. And I think this probably connects to what I was trying to say in answer to your last question, in the sense that in both of those cases, it's like, you know, we use this language that is predicated on like objectifying the natural world, has also been like historically been used to objectify and oppress women and other marginalized groups. And so something like poetry that can really talk and investigate, talk with, you know, RQUE, not talk, the language can kind of show us glimpses of another form of relation, I think. And I think I was also quite inspired by, I think in the years that were like leading up to starting to write this book, I was reading a lot of environmental philosophy, and I remember reading the philosopher Luce Irigaray say something about there's being like a kind of mimetic or tactical solidarity between women and the environment. When people asked her about, you know, why she was kind of writing from the position of like Earth as a woman and stuff like that. And so sometimes I think there can be this like almost like tactical allying to speak back against this kind of patriarchal language. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think your language, you know, it really does that. It doesn't just do that thematically, but it almost feels that it does that structurally. It's undoing types of language which are damaging and sort of potentially introducing new forms of language. I'm not claiming that, you know, these of course can transform overnight, you know, our forms of practice, but it seems like a powerful thing to do. And I guess I just wanted to ask one more thing about that kind of specific use of language, which is this does feel like a book which is, you know, deeply politically and intellectually committed, but it is so through its language and its very specific style, which I guess I'll describe as a mixture of kind of lyric and innovative at the same time. And I was just wondering whether there were particular writers in any genre who had had an influence on that style, because it feels to me, you know, this is a terrible tautology, but quite unique. And so I'd just be curious whether you feel you were in conversation in building that style with other writers.
Yeah, I mean, there are writers whose work I feel very close to, maybe not in the sense that I feel similar to them, but there's just something about their work that every time I revisit it, I'm just kind of come away thinking like, what on earth am I doing? And I suppose that would be people like Lisa Robertson, Denise Riley, probably Anne Carson too, like a handful of others. But I think it might also be something to do with the fact that I feel a bit like I fell backwards into poetry, because I was at art school, and I did art history, and I started, I suppose I started writing more seriously then, but I didn't really have this sense of like a huge sense of the canon, or really like how a poem should be. Like I didn't have a mentor or like workshops. I really wish I had, because I feel like I've had to like catch up with quite a lot of things. But yeah, so some of it I think is just a kind of genuine excitement about finding things, finding people's work that resonates with me, and maybe half of it is fluke. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question because we have lots of questions building up in the chat, which is great. If anyone else wants to ask, by the way, please put them in the Q&A because I'm going to go to them in a second. You know, again, I mean, in a way, this is unfair because it's such a huge question, but obviously, you know, one of the kind of focuses of this series, apart from obviously just centering incredible poetry, is a kind of not just an amplification, but also a consideration of the challenges for marginalized voices, you know, within poetry, and kind of just opening up conversations which aren't always had. And obviously there are so many different things we could talk about in regard to that, but I was just curious to ask you, because I think it's a bit of an underexplored question, is really the question of class in poetry. And what I wanted to ask is, from your perspective, what challenges do you think working class poets face in getting their work known in the UK? What, I mean, there are many, but what, if anything, do you think has kind of changed for the better, and what still needs to be done, you know, for you as a writer, but also as a reader?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's huge. I think, I mean, I remember like listening to Rachel Allen, and I think it was with Anthony Naxaguru speaking really eloquently about this. And I feel like I can kind of only reiterate their point, which is something I really agree with, is this sense that like, on some level, there's perhaps an expectation of what certain voices should be and how they should sound, and maybe like particular issues that they should engage with, that I think I would find really limiting And I've spoken to other poets who find that that limiting as well. I think there's obviously there's like, yeah, numerous like economic and structural barriers that sometimes seem only surpassable if you kind of fit into like a particular template. So I would say, yeah, a kind of a wider set of definitions and letting poets kind of self-define would be really helpful. And I think it's just like it can be quite limiting, and I found this as well, like since I've started teaching more as well, this sense of like accessibility in poetry, which I do think is related to issues of class, and this idea of like, well, who is setting the bar of like what accessibility is, because that's not like an objective bar, you know, and who's setting that and who is like who for. So I say, yeah, those are the things that go through my mind most of the time. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Thank you so much. And yeah, I appreciate that was a ridiculously huge question, but it's still really interesting to get your reflection on that. Thank you so much. I'm going to move into some of the questions from the Q&A. There are 3 questions here which have all been phrased slightly differently, but they are all touching on something which Daisy mentioned sort of in the preamble, which is, well, there's 2 elements. There's the fact that you found it quite difficult to write in the pandemic. Someone's written, you know, I think you said earlier you haven't written a poem during the pandemic, and quite a lot of people were curious about that. But also the second part of that question was, that being said, it would be great to hear about what conditions you find ideal for you to write in. And how do you try and investigate and pin down a train of thought before attempting to get it into a particular form on paper? So yeah, just questions there about what's been so difficult about the pandemic in regards to writing, and what you find a productive and conducive kind of writing environment for you to be.
Yeah, of course. It's so funny because, you know, I say that I don't want to like draw these lines between genres, but then I also know that like some days I can do one kind of writing and not another. And I suppose the last year, which, you know, I've had like a number of like difficult circumstances in my personal life, which has made writing difficult. But when I have been able to write, I've been trying to finish my PhD, which is a very, you've frozen, Rebecca, but can you still hear me? I'm just going to keep speaking.
I can sort of be Rebecca for a moment while she's frozen.
I just didn't know if I had frozen off Rebecca.
No, you're still yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, and I suppose my PhD engages with like a lot of scientific material, and it's just a very different headspace. But in terms of my process for writing poetry, I think I have to have like some degree of kind of almost like daydream headspace, free, which is, you know, hard to come by when you're like, yeah, working and doing any number of other things. But what I do is I tend to just kind of accrue little notes or combinations of words or phrases that kind of crop up around what I'm reading, and I put them all in like, you know, the notes on my phone or in a notebook, and then at some point I'll sit down and try and assemble them into a poem, and usually they don't want to be there, and it's a very painful, awful process, and I'll reject it, and then sometimes it's yeah, there's just this kind of like inexplicable moment where things seem to come together. Yeah, and then there's a poem in it, and I didn't plan what would be in it, and that's my favorite way. That's my favorite way to write, which doesn't work very well when someone like asks you to write a poem in a particular thing, because then you have to be thinking about it and as soon as you think about it, it's like yeah, it's like you've got almost like closed down some of the avenues or something. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, and apologies for whatever tech failure happened there. But I caught most of what you said. Thank you. I think a follow-up question that has some connection perhaps to questions of process is a question here that says, I think it's great how you've moved across different forms with your writing and art. Did you find this difficult to navigate from a publishing perspective, or was it a more organic process? Thank you.
When you say difficult from a publishing process, do you mean like it was harder to, I found it harder to become published, or?
I'm not totally sure. The person might potentially follow up, but I think, yeah, I think the question is almost about the professional difficulties of moving between forms, and whether that posed any challenge in itself.
I don't think I found any huge obstacles. Maybe I've just been really lucky. But I think I actually found it really helpful to feel, I mean, the two industries are quite close anyway, so it's not like, I've come from like being a neuroscientist or something, but in some ways I found it helpful to have that little bit of distance. And I feel like it could have gone the other way, like maybe if I had done like English literature or creative writing, I would have been more inclined to becoming a visual artist and making the majority of my work in that medium. So I think sometimes it's like a case of knowing yourself and like just whether you work best kind of really embedded in one thing, or whether you actually like being a bit more mobile and maybe just kind of not having a huge presence in one thing, but feeling like you can move between forms, which I found really helpful. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but
great, thank you. Got a question here from Bethan. I wondered if you could talk around the idea of negative capability, or putting your own poetic ways of knowing amongst scientific ways of knowing, and where that takes you. And then she's just added, have you ever worked directly alongside or in collaboration with scientists?
Cool. Yeah, so I love negative capability. And yeah, I think I've always felt that in terms of writing, I've never really felt compelled to write about something that I already understand, because I just I wouldn't get anything from it personally. Usually if I write about something, it's like something I need to kind of almost like try and metabolize through writing about it, like over and over again in different ways, and seeing if I can have like another kind of grasp of it, which I'm just realizing this on the spot, but maybe that's why I've kind of gravitated towards writing about scientific subjects, because I don't think I have a very scientifically minded way of being. So but I just find I'm completely attracted to writing about things that I don't fully understand, and also things that that trouble me, and I think that can be a really productive and fertile space. And in terms of collaborating with scientists, I'm really hesitant about using the term collaborate, not generally, but I guess I mean in this particular circumstance, because part of my PhD is like partly supervised by a molecular epidemiologist who's really great, and I accompanied some scientific research in northern Tanzania and kind of almost shadowed people in the lab, but I didn't really feel like that was a collaboration, I suppose. I mean, I think maybe it has, in like the sense of I wouldn't have been able to write some of the things I do had they not like generously given some of their time to me. But I think collaborating in a more direct way is something I'd be really interested in. But it's, yeah, I think maybe now I could do it, but it takes, like, for me anyway, it takes like a while to work up the confidence to just, you know, approach a scientist and say, let's collaborate. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There's a couple of questions that I just want to dive into here, which are about very specific poems from the collection. There's one question saying, oh, thanks so much for the reading. And they said, I'm always so struck by your poem Fossil Dinner, which you will have all heard an extract from. Could you talk a little bit more about it and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, that's like quite an unusual poem in the collection, because it's like maybe the only example where I wrote it, it's one of the most recent poems that I wrote in the collection, but the notes for it were maybe like 4 or so years old by that point. And I tried to write something with them at the time and it just didn't come together. And then years later, I found like the crusty old Word doc and was like, oh, I can do something with this. And I think at that point I was writing or had just finished writing my undergrad dissertation on Hildegard of Bingen. And so I was reading a lot around like kind of medieval theology and female mysticism. And I think a lot of the phrases in that poem I think they were like notes and things that I made around that time. And I think I was also just starting to read about geology. And somewhere, this kind of idea of like the dinner table came into my mind with the kind of geological layers, but also these kind of like abrasive men around the table. And I think this was also, I was just on the verge of starting my PhD, and I had a lot of, like no one in my family has like been through academia. And so I had all of these like, what on earth is academia? And so I imagined this like dinner table of like what my strange ideas of like what departmental dinners might be like. Yeah.
That's really, really interesting. That really opens up, actually. I want to go back to that poem now and think about it in light of what you've just said. Thank you. And another very specific poem question is just from Trisha here. What was the inspiration for the poem What Jeannie Got? If you know.
Yeah, again, I mean, that was a poem that I think I had made, like I had like a couple of phrases or notes for, but that was one that really almost just felt like automatic writing almost. And I don't mean to like, you know, like mystify the process or anything, or like the muse came, but it's like, it doesn't happen to me very often, but I just started writing and that's what came out. And the biblical quotation in there, I think had just been, it must have just been knocking around my mind. Like I was partly raised in a quite intense evangelical church. So sometimes I'll just be going about my day and some kind of like Bible verse or something will come to me. And yeah, I felt like a very like visceral emotional connection to that poem while I was writing it. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't think I can say anything more articulate about that poem.
That's very interesting in itself. Thank you, Daisy. There's a question here, which from Lucy. Do you think Louis Pasteur's paranoia or perceived paranoia surrounding the non-human affected your writing in any way?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it did. I think I kind of, you know, used him as like almost like the villain. You know, I got to use him as like the villain of the book because like you know, there's this whole kind of like amazing like food culture that has like sprung up in the wake of like Pasteur's like germ phobia, you know, and like fermenting cultures and various other things. And so I think, I mean, obviously, like, you know, there was like aspects of germ phobia and like, well, I'm not sure actually. I was going to say like germophobia was around before Pasteur, but obviously like Pasteur was like primarily the one that figured out that, you know, some microbes give you diseases. And like when like scientists earlier than Pasteur observed like various microorganisms, they just thought they were like, you know, little animals. They just thought they were quite entertaining. So I think, yeah, I just found him like this really kind of like horribly perfect figure to try and navigate some of the things that I was talking about in the collection, and also, you know, his hatred of like microbial life went hand in hand with like he had really right-wing politics, and he was like he had this hatred of the masses as well, and it was almost like the way he talks about germs and the way he would talk about like the proletariat rising up, it's like he just kind of merged the two in his mind. So yeah, I don't feel bad using him as the villain of the book. Yeah,
that sounds pretty valid. That's really interesting, thank you. Okay, we are a little bit over time, which is fine, but may not be able to answer every question. But there's just a question here about what you're working on at the moment, in light of you saying that you haven't been writing a huge amount of poetry at the moment, and this attendee is just wondering if there's anything else you've been working on.
Yeah, well, I'm about 1 week away from submitting my PhD, which is probably why I haven't been quite so articulate this evening, because my brain's a bit all over the place. And that is like a book of nonfiction about kind of about some of the things we've been talking about this evening, about a kind of intimacy with infectious life, and all of the difficulties like that lie therein. Yeah, and then like a few other things on the back burner, but I don't want to jinx them by talking about them just yet. So
yeah, that makes complete sense. Thank you so much. Maybe the final question we have time for, which is, and there's just a reflection here from someone saying that in your poetry and fiction you use historical figures, you know, whether it's in detail, whether it's just something briefly, you know, about them and events in their lives. And they just wanted to know, you know, is there, I mean, you've of course talked about Pasteur, but is there a reason that you use certain figures? How do you come across them? What's your relationship with those historical figures?
Yeah, that's really interesting. The way I come across them is, I guess, through reading, and sometimes doing the kind of reading where you almost like let your mind drift, and these figures almost become like characters. And I suppose sometimes with like talking about something like ecology or the environment, it can become so abstract so quickly, or it can fall into the kind of like you know, idealizing nature, idealizing the non-human. And so I think sometimes like using characters or even names is just like a kind of like a stand-in for something, is almost like a way to like populate the scene, or some like, you know, like sometimes I think of it as like a play or a drama of like historical forces or like different ways of viewing the environment. And, you know, like Linnaeus is over here, like maybe like Rousseau's like has like a magnifying glass out or something, and I think it can become quite comic or something sometimes. But yeah, I'm going to keep thinking about that. That's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to stop there. Apologies to those of you who didn't have a chance for your questions to be included. Also, just wanted to pass on how much positivity there was in the Q&A, and thanks for you know, the experience of hearing your poetry live and appreciation. Thank you, Daisy, so much for being part of this event. We truly appreciate it. And thank you, all audience members, for being part of it and for spending your Monday evening with us. We really appreciate your time. And I will leave it there. But before we do, I just want to encourage you, if you haven't already, to read Daisy's book, Life Without Air, which is published by Granta. And Daisy, when is your first novel, Paul, coming out with Granta? Is it August?
Yeah, 5th of August.
It's August, so I would strongly encourage all of you to keep your eye out for that. For I was going to say, you could take it on your holiday, but that's actually a delusion. But you can read it, in the park. It doesn't matter where you read it, 'cause it's going to be great. All right, thank you so much, Daisy, and thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Good night.